And now, if Gandhi was alive, the very reason he gave for not being a secularist then would be a reason why he would be a secularist now. He said, there's no need for us to be secularists because the damage that happened in Europe has not happened here. But it has happened here now.
In that context, is secularism the only tool that creates a multicultural, multi-plural society?
No, I'm saying secularism and multiculturalism are different doctrines. Secularism emerges because an unself-conscious pluralism or multiculturalism is ruined by nationalism of the European kind.
Do you need secularism only to defend religion from religion, or even generic ideologies that aim to homogenize culture?
That's enforced secularization. That's not secularism. Secularism can allow people to dress as they like, eat as their religion demands, all that.
Hindutva, for example, its contemporary thinkers, say for example like J. Sai Deepak, they are deploying theories like decoloniality.
The way you had these nation building exercises, the way you generated feeling for the nation was done by something that was a very standard ploy all over Europe. And you say the nation is ours, it's not theirs.
Where do you think secularism as an idea has failed? Starting with, what do you think secularism is?
You can't adopt a capitalist economy and claim that you have a constitutional right to equality. I mean, you're never going to achieve it.
You talked about this conflict between certain ideals and whether these ideals are in clash with certain ideologies, let's say religious frameworks. What would be the methodology to analyze that?
It's a blasphemous book. There's no doubt it is a blasphemous book. So they wanted to ban it. But if you're committed to free speech, then you can't ban it.
Secularism is often invoked but rarely understood, especially in the Indian context. Today we explore secularism, its philosophical foundations, its limits, and its contested place in India's political imagination. Joining us is Professor Akeel Bilgrami, one of the leading contemporary thinkers on secularism, identity, and post-colonial political thought. We discussed the European origins of secularism, Gandhi's ambivalence towards it, Hindutva critiques, and the tension between ideology and constitutional rights.
Welcome, Professor Akeel Bilgrami. It is very exciting to talk to you. You are one of those, intellectual giants that we've grown reading, and it is one of, great opportunities for me to have this interaction with you. As I told you that my humble background being in philosophy, politics, and economics, and studying these subjects together gave me certain perspectives, and then becoming part of, witnessing student politics in JNU during the CA movement. What became very evident for me, especially in a campus like JNU, that the ideals of secularism, liberalism, decoloniality, devoid of context and specificity, they do not create realities that they are supposed to suggest intellectually. Secularism has been that ideal for a long time. For almost, a few hundred years, the secular ideal has forced proportionate or forced creation of institutions, even like nation state, in which certain kinds of interactions between different kinds of identities are imagined and certain impacts and effects expected. But as we live in 21st century, we are living in a far-right global world order. Everybody is out for killing each other. Where do you think secularism as an idea has failed? Starting with, what do you think secularism is?
So, I don't believe that secularism is a kind of unique formation in India, as many people now do. That was first said by Radhakrishnan, and then Amartya Sen said it, and now there's a whole infantry of academics who follow them. And that view is that secularism in India is just a kind of neutrality between different religions, or sort of neutral distinction, and Radha Krishnan, let's call it the Radha Krishnan Sen view, and is I think not right. I mean, if you look carefully at the Constituent Assembly debates, it doesn't capture what actually happened in Indian history of that period. And but it keeps getting repeated, and even judges after particular cases make pronouncements of that kind. But that's not my view. I don't think it's accurate. Keeps faith with constitutional history in India. So my view is that secularism is a political doctrine. It's a doctrine which tries to keep religion out of a direct influence. Indirect influence nobody can stop, because it depends on all sorts of practices and so on. But keep religion from having a direct bearing on institutions of state and the polity generally, political institutions generally. How it does so is, in my view, takes the following form. I call it a lexicographical conception of, or lexicographical ordering conception of secularism, which helps to bring out clearly and cleanly what secularism was always intended to be anyway. And that is that in democratic societies, you have certain commitments to freedom of religious practice and belief. People should be allowed to believe in any God they like, any doctrine they like, and commit various practices, which their religion requires. So there's a certain amount of freedom granted, a commitment to freedom of religion, in both doctrine or belief and practices, cultural practices, rituals, etc. Forms of dress, things like that. Now, that's one commitment. And then there's another commitment to certain general constitutional principles. And those principles are very well known. But the most well known of them is things like free speech, and freedom of worship falls within that. But free speech is one such principle, and it was always granted. So there's certain constitutional principles, and they don't mention religion or opposition to religion. They just neutrally. So let's take free speech, which is the most, it's adopted by all liberal democratic societies. And in other societies, such as, say, the Soviet Union, you might have different principles. You may not have maybe principles about private property not being allowed and so on. So anyway, so you have some principles, constitutional principles, and they don't particularly mention religion or opposition to religion. They're new. And then what I call the crucial step in secularism is a third principle, which is about these two principles, and which says if there's a clash between these two, if somebody's religious practices, for instance, clash with these principles, such as, say, free speech, then the constitutional principles, which should be placed prior to them, and the practices should be placed second. So only if there's a clash should one not allow the religious practices. Only if there's a clash with some constitutional principles should one not allow the religious practices or beliefs to be. But otherwise, religious practices should be allowed to flourish. But if they clash with, say, principles of free speech, etc., then the free speech ones comes first.
So, for example, you talked about this conflict between certain ideals and whether these ideals are in clash with certain ideologies, let's say religious, frameworks. What would be the methodology to analyze that? For example, if there is an ideal of equality. So how do you see equality? Because between genders...
Well, there's no constitutional commitment. There can be vague constitutional voicings or aspirational voicings towards equality. Nobody. And so socialism was never, it was, it is socialist pattern. It's a completely vague, preambular statement. So equality is not a constitutional right in the way that free speech is supposed to be. So, I mean, you can't adopt a capitalist economy and claim that you constitutionally have equality. I mean, you're never going to achieve it. And so then it's just an aspiration. But I'm talking about serious commitments to rights. And free speech is supposed to be such a commitment. So the point is that if there's a clash, so if right here on campus, you wanted to say something about Kashmir, or you wanted to say something about speak out, and you're not allowed to do that, right? Or you're put in jail for doing that, etc. Right? That's a violation of the lexicographical ordering I was talking about, which is that there's free speech, and then so suppose some Hindutva body says, no, you can't say something about Kashmir, or you can't say something about, then and they say this is part of it. It's a Hindu country, you can't say things of that kind. Well, then the lexicographical ordering kicks in, and you say, well, that may be your religion, but it clashes with our commitment.
Can you expand more on lexicographic ordering, Professor, so that viewers understand?
Lexicographical ordering is that if there's a clash between what a religion and its practices want, right, and this constitutional principle, let's say, of free speech, if there's a clash, then this must be placed over the religious practice. That it gets an order. Lexicographical ordering is a technical term, actually. It's a term in mathematics, but in dictionaries, for instance, there's some definitions which come first, and there's some definitions which are secondary. So the point is, this will overrule that if there's a clash. And by the way, I just gave an example in one direction of censoring speech because of commitment to rule the law, but it could be the other way around too. After all, the banning of Salman Rushdie's satanic verses, right, was also, from the point of view of religious practices, it's a blasphemous book. There's no doubt it is a blasphemous book. So they wanted to ban it. But if you're committed to free speech, then you can't ban it.
Even banning of RSS in 1975 or the banning of Jamaat-e-Islami, for example, in that context, in the Indira Gandhi government, also constitute the barring of free speech.
That's exactly right. So they, it was banned. And so you can't, any banning of a book on religious grounds, right, would be a non-secular act, because the lexicographical ordering requires that the constitutional principle of free speech have priority over the religious practices, which may demand the banning of a book, which may demand not allowing people to say what they want about Kashmir or whatever. So that's the idea of secularism. It's a perfectly straightforward thing. You allow religious practices, you have certain constitutional principles. If the religion practices clash with this comes first. That's it. That's secularism. That's what secularism was in Europe. That's what secularism was committed to be by our constitutional, framers. And now all this other stuff on how there must be neutrality between religions. Of course, there was a lot of rhetoric about that, but what that meant was, when you apply the lexicographical ordering, you must be completely neutral between applying it when Hindu religious practices demand certain things. You still have free speech, and if Muslim religious practices demand the banning of a book, you still put free speech first. You must be neutral in applying this notion of secularism. So it's not an alternative notion of secularism, this neutrality stuff. This is just a confusion on Radhakrishna's part. It's not a neutrality between religions per se. It's a neutrality that's not an alternative definition of secularism. That's a way of applying the only definition of secularism there is, which is the lexicographical order, and applying it neutrally.
So one of the things that I understand, Professor, is that the way the Constitution has imagined these fundamental rights in correlation or relation with certain religious commitments to those kinds of ideals in their own imaginations, constitutional interpretations take precedence. But again, Hindutva, for example, its contemporary thinkers, say for example like J. Sai Deepak, they are deploying theories like decoloniality and says that the Indian constitution itself, it's a colonial document in terms of its deploying these categories in terms of interpretation of neutrality.
That's right. So they're saying secularism is a European colonial...
Even, free speech. They would say, what is the limit to free speech?
Yeah, so that's true. But let's just face it. They can say that, but when they say that, they are anti-secularists. They're opposed to secularism because we don't believe that it's a colonial doctrine. It comes from European colonial masters. And it's true. It happened in Europe for us. And so all these things that you're saying, they're anti-secularist. That's true. They are. They're against secularism. They're, as you said, they're against secularism, claiming that secularism is a colonial.
Because you have engaged a lot with Gandhi, and in a sense, Gandhi was the early 20th century debates are not, in a way, context agnostic.
Exactly.
So these are the people that
that's a good point.
Interacting with.
Yes, that's absolutely right. You see, to understand that, you have to go back to, as I said, and these people who say that it's if you want to decolonize, then you shouldn't tax secularism, right? Here's a way of understanding that whole background for that. The background for that is that in Europe, and there's no doubt that secularism originated in Europe, and in Europe, secularism originated because when nations were formed after Westphalia, the way in which you generated a feeling for the nation, what is called nationalism, the way you had these nation-building exercises, the way you generated feeling for the nation, was done by something that was a very standard ploy all over Europe, which is to find an external enemy within the territory and you oppress it, you subjugate it, you despise it, and so on. And you say the nation is ours, it's not theirs. This was done with the Jews all over Europe. This was done with the Irish in Britain. This was done with the Protestants in all Catholic countries, with the Catholics in all Protestant countries. Protestant-dominated population. And so this was the standard way in Europe in which nations were developed. You created a feeling for the nation by generating a hatred for particular things, and it's an outsider. The nation doesn't belong to it, belongs to us. And Gandhi in India said that this is kind of nationalism we've never had. He claimed that this is another nationalism we've never had. Hindus and Muslims, he said, live side by side with each other, Sikhs. Since we've just assimilated whatever came, it's been... so he said we have an unself-conscious culture of religious pluralism, and this kind of nation-building has never happened in India. This is what Gandhi said all through that early part of the freedom movement. So secularism never figured in his thinking. But so his reason was secularism arose in the West to repair this damage of majoritarianism. So let me sum it up. In Europe, secularism arose because you had this kind of nation-building exercises which created conflict between external enemies within, which are minorities, and majorities. Majorities wanted to create a nationalism by saying the nation is ours, not theirs. And that created a feeling which came to be called nationalism. And often the majoritarianism was religious majoritarianism, as I said about Protestants. And secularism came to, and then there were minoritarian backlashes. Obviously, there would be if you have that kind of religious majoritarianism. So secularism came to say, let's get religion out of the orbit of the polity, because it's just creating this kind of civil conflict everywhere. So to sum it up, secularism emerged as a doctrine which was political doctrine, a political system by which you kept religion out of the polity, because if you allowed it in, it created this kind of nationalism based on religious majoritarianism, with minorities reacting to it. And so you got this religious conflict. So get religion out of the orbit of the polity. That's how secularism arose, to repair the damage created by nationalism of a religious majoritarian kind. Gandhi said, this has not happened in India, so there's no damage to repair. So he never was committed to secularism. But the fact is that since the 1980s, that's exactly what is going on in India. They have found, you do find religious majoritarianism being exercised in the name of nationalism. And this is everywhere present since the 1980s in this country. And the reasons for that are very interesting, why they arose in the 1980s or soon just before that, in this form, in this European form. So we began to mimic Europe seriously only
after independence.
In the last 50 years. Since the late 1970s, 80s onwards, we began to have this phenomenon that you find called Hindutva and so on and so forth. You had antecedents like Savarkar and so on, and Mayasabite elements in the Congress, but they were antecedents. The roots were set in the 70s and 80s for what we are saying now. And now, if Gandhi was alive, the very reason he gave for not being a secularist then would be a reason why he would be a secularist now. Because he said, there's no need for us to be secularists because what happened, the damage that happened in Europe has not happened here. But it has happened here now. So he would be the first to say that it's relevant now.
So, because I'm reminded of the debates that Gandhi and others had, and Indian society was also a product of two kinds of rules that happened. One is the Mughal Muslim rule, and the other is the British rule. So do you think that, for example, Akbar of Dara Shikoh, or other thinkers who were once dealing with the multicultural, multi-plural society and antagonism between societies, they came up with their own versions of dealing with plurality in a way that, in a certain sense, secularizes state, which was...
It's not secularizes. It's a kind of unself-conscious pluralism that emerged from people living together. Look, think of Islam. See, if you think of how Islam came to South Asia, what is now called South Asia, but then was called India. How did Islam come to this part of the world? It came via Persia, Central Asia, Afghanistan, and then Kenya. And at each place, it accrued its own local forms of Islam. It was not the Islam that, Wahhabis, for instance, who talk about the originary Islam of the 7th century in the Arabian Downs. It wasn't that at all. At each stage, it accrued local roots. And it sedimented here in a, very broadly existing culture, which, if you like, you can call Hindu culture. And it set roots here, and at each place it acquired roots. So the Islam over here, what we call the Indo-Persian culture, it's nothing like what the originary Islam, And when Wahhabis and all want to say, this is Islam, they're completely distorting our own history. So you had this complete, as you call it, it's a multicultural, it's not secularized. It's wrong to call it. It was a sort of multi-religious pluralism. And it was completely unself-conscious. It sort of grew with the roots of people, adopting to each other's cultures in that way. Islam adopted, Hinduism adopted, it became a common culture.
So in that context, is secularism the only tool that creates a multicultural, multi-plural society?
No, I'm saying secularism and multiculturalism are different doctrines. Secularism emerges because an unself-conscious pluralism or multiculturalism is ruined by nationalism of the European kind. when this unself-conscious pluralism is ruined by nationalism, by creating minorities that you hate, and then having the minorities react and then say, okay, now we must stop this religious conflict.
So secularism is a product of marginalization of certain minorities in whose response
Used to fight back, and then that creates religious conflict, and then secularism says, enough of religious conflict, let's get religion out of having any central role. So it's there to repair the damage created by majoritarian nationalists.
let's say, for example, keeping aside religious populations, let's say, for example, Russia, China, or other people, do you need secularism only to defend religion from religion, or even generic ideologies that aim to homogenize culture in...
That's a different... The idea, that's secularization. That's not secularism.
Please differentiate with this.
So secularism is there to repair a certain damage that arose out of nationalism. It's a political doctrine. Secularization is a very different phenomenon. Secularization is just loss of belief in God, which began, started very incipiently in the 18th century, let's say, in Europe. And loss of belief and decrease in rituals and church going and so on in Europe. People just stopped going to churches in large numbers. People stopped carrying out religious rituals. They stopped dressing in a certain way. Their dads would, changed and so on. All of this was called secularization. And that can be enforced by the state. So Turkey did it, and the Ataturk, Soviet Union did it, and so on. So that's enforced secularization. That's not secularism. Secularism can allow people to dress as they like, eat as their religion demands, all that, so long as it doesn't clash with the constitutional principles. It's a completely different doctrine. Secularization is just a natural process of loss of belief, loss of church going, and so on. And it could happen for all sorts of reasons. I mean, in Europe, people stopped going to churches. Why? Because in the late 19th century, labor movements arose all over Europe. And labor movements gave people community solidarity and union meetings every 3 or 4 times a week. People prefer to do that. Working people prefer to do that than go to church. So you can have secularization happening in very natural developments in society. It's got nothing to do with the state political doctrine being imposed and so on. That only happened because of religious conflict.
So how do you deal with this present reality in India, where Hindutva as a paradigm is dominating, and the core argument that they produce is that in the name of secularism, what happened was secularization of the state in opposition to Hinduism and Indic culture, Indic cultural civilization as a foundational bed to it. So in a sense, for them, secularism, secularization, anti-Hindu behavior, constitutional colonialism is an embedded reality coming from both the secular left liberal and the Muslim other who has historically ruled. How do we internalize, this present context, and how do we respond to that?
I think that what happened in Shaheen Bagh was actually making the right demands. So I think what the Shaheen Bagh protesters, it's not just Shaheen Bagh, this was spread to every small town virtually in the country, were very impressive. They were making the right demands. I think it's a great, great shared tragedy, in fact, that it came to an end partly because of COVID, but the government also just rode the stall. They managed to. But I think what those young people and Muslims and Muslim women and so on were protesting were absolutely right. They were appealing to constitutional principles, which are part of our constitution. The fact is that you can't say it's a colonial political doctrine and state institution because, after all, it arose naturally in Europe to repair a certain damage. That damage has occurred here in the last 50 years. So
it's exactly the kind of damage that we...
Exactly. So, if it arose naturally to repair a certain damage, it has application now because that damage has occurred. So that's a very important thing to stress. And I believe the Shaheen protesters were stressing that. They were saying, look, we have a constitution here which gives lexicographical priority to these principles. You can't just, treat it, say because of your religion, you're going to treat a particular community in this way. And what is interesting to me about those protests was that they appealed to, if you looked at the posters and what was happening in the actual jouissance of their protest, it was really appealing to a very multicultural, sort of unself-conscious pluralist past. And they're appealing to Kabir, they're appealing to all sorts of things which are part of this unself-conscious pluralism of the past, while the appeal was for abstract constitutional principles of that kind. So in that sense, I think what was happening in Shaheen Bagh was an extremely interesting mix of this unself-conscious pluralism that Gandhi said never demonized, combined with secularist constitutional principles. So the means they had for protest, the posters, that was full of this cultural pluralist past that they were tapping, while arguing for something very abstract. Nobody had done that before. We should really try and understand. Nobody had done that before. Ambedkar didn't do it. He was just a constitutionalist. And Jawaharlal had something like that idea in Discovery of India, but Jawaharlal, when he came into power, was not. Gandhi stressed the one, but Gandhi never believed in constitutional principles, etc. So that was not his conception of governance. This liberal form of his was much more participatory democracy. He had ideas of an nonviolent state, so it was not going to merit any kind of liberalism. So nobody had done this combination before. Gandhi on the one side had only stressed the council pluralism and the modern state that Nehruvian after independence was adopted was the abstract constitutional principle. This combination was a very remarkable thing that these young people managed to achieve, and I think that's very well worth studying, that combination of things.
One final question, sir. Because you mentioned Ambedkar, and Ambedkar wrote his book, Annihilation of Caste, which had an implicit argument of annihilation of religion, in the sense Hinduism structures or orders caste as an ontological hierarchy. And so when we have a constitutional principle of equality, say, for example, or the constitutional principle of giving equal opportunities to different kinds of people, if we have competing ideological structures which orders existence in certain ways, one is absolute hierarchy, one is horizontal equity. So how do you choose between them in terms of the lexicographic ordering, while not reducing the rights of certain groups who are claiming that in this secular Indian state, the Brahminical order as well as the Dalit liberation, they both occupy, the same space.
Well, caste is a very complicated thing. It's not the same thing all over India. Caste in Haryana is very different from caste in Maharashtra, very different from caste in the south. And I think it's foolish to think that it's one phenomenon. But you're certainly right that that mere legislation, and it's not a matter of secularism really. It's a matter of affirmative action. Legislation that Ambedkar, was a remarkable formulator of affirmative action in form of minority rights of various kinds for Dalits and for Sharia tribes. And I think that is a phenomenon which is completely different. And the fact is that at the end of his life, in the last few years, Ambedkar realized that legislation is insufficient, maybe necessary, of course. But, he broke his lion's heart, thinking that legislation would overcome this, and it isn't. For sure. And it's very, you see, what happened in the 80s onwards is partly that with Mundell and the influence of Mundell in politics, it changed the politics from 80s onwards. And there's no doubt that once the whole question of backward castes also was introduced into politics, there was a kind of democratization of Indian politics, because you found all sorts of people from castes that had no privilege or power whatsoever began to be given some power and privilege. But that it created a whole culture of benefits. And so that was, it had two sides. It was tremendously democratizing. This kind of thing had never happened before under the whole Nehruvian period. It's pretty much hypercast. The Mandalization of politics created a kind of participatory electoral success of castes we'd never had that before. And there's no doubt that that is participatory and democratic, and it's a good development. But with neoliberal capital, this took the form of basically creating a culture of benefits. And now you find that there are tendencies which will make it very hard to annihilate castes, because castes want to keep their identity in order to get for instance, caste panchayats force, a sort of retention of indigenous conceptions of caste.
Kind of a contradiction. What affirmative action was, intended to do was...
under neoliberalism, Ambedkar's idea was you empower castes, and when they are empowered enough, you'll annihilate. But if empowerment under neoliberalism takes the form of this culture of benefits, that people want to retain the caste identity to continue to get the benefits, and as a result, an racial caste keeps receding as a code. That's a very difficult thing. You have to really re-theorize the whole thing. Now,
your concluding remarks on Indian Muslims, because you're working on it, maybe because you also have a ethnic background or social background from Muslim lineage. How do you think that problem in India really needs to be tackled? Just final remarks, some observations.
Well, one of the things is that Hindutva has spread quite successfully in the cultural domain. And it's not obvious that Hindutva will spread to the south. They're starting to, you see, but Hindutva seems like a northern imposition on the south. So unless Hindutva adapts to southern Hinduism and creates a new sort of entirely new complexion for Hindutva in the south will not accept Hindutva. So that's one. So if you have a stronger federalism, you could have the south at least, and Bengal, who knows, we'll see now. But already Hindutva is making inroads. They're talking about Kumbh Mela and Kerala and things like that. So they're seeing the importance of not making Hindutva seem like an imposition on the south, how to adapt Hindutva to southern Hinduism.
Terminologies and experiences and practices.
And so on. So those are the things to watch out for.
They're basically internalizing Hindutva, like the way...
They're setting the agenda. So even the left will then have to, stop...
responding to the...
That's what the Congress has been doing in the north anyway, so...
Thank you, Dr. Bilgrami. It was wonderful talking to you. I hope that when you go back, we could find more time online to have deeper discussions.
I actually enjoyed that.